Hello and welcome to another event in our Tech Talk series. Today's presentation will cover Apex Code. As you may know, Salesforce.com is a publicly traded company, and therefore we do need to share this safe harbor statement with you to let you know that any forward-looking statements are just that, forward-looking statements. If you'd like to learn more about the safe harbor statement, you can find it on our website under the Investor Relations section. So with that, I'd like to introduce Taggart Matthiessen.
Okay, everyone. My name is Taggart Matthiessen, and I am the product owner for Apex Code. And today we're going to talk about what's new in the winter release, as well as some roadmap items. We've got about an hour to go through these topics. First, we'll walk through Batch Apex and custom settings. Both were released in the winter 10. And then we'll talk about the Apex Scheduler, which is a pilot feature that we are planning to release in spring. And then I will cover just some general roadmap topics looking at what's ahead for Apex Code in the next year and a half. And then with the time remaining, go through some Q&A items. Okay, so let's get started. Batch Apex, and apologies for those that were at Dreamforce. A lot of this information I've covered in the past, but hopefully for those that were unable to join, this will be new and exciting material. So Batch Apex, I typically like to describe this feature in the context of what we couldn't do in the past. And a good use case to look at is the concept of an owner reassignment tool. Let's say that an organization wanted to build a process that reassigned hundreds of thousands of records from a set of owners to another set of owners. Well, in the past, there wasn't really any good way to do this on our platform natively. And the typical solution was to implement a client process that would be activated, pull the data down into the client service or process, perform the updates, and then propagate that information back up to Salesforce. With Batch Apex, we actually can now allow you to do this natively on our platform. And with Batch Apex, the interface allows us to provide kind of a framework for people to build complex, long-running operations. So whether it's the owner reassignment that I just discussed, or kind of a concept of a search and replace, so doing a data cleansing activity over thousands of records, hundreds of thousands of records, or millions of records, Batch Apex is really kind of the tool to do that. And it's not just owner reassignment, search and replace. It's also data validation, data cleansing, and data enrichment. And even within those categories, it's not just about performing these operations within Salesforce by itself. It's also leveraging the ability to perform callouts from the executes within the batch process to leverage third-party tools or services to perform those additional activities. And then the last use case, which is somewhat interesting and not completely unique, but not too many people look at it, is from a reporting standpoint, we have a very powerful declarative tool, but there's certain limitations in what you can report against. And so with Batch Apex, what it allows you to do is take very complex hierarchical relationships and roll those up into summary level objects, whether it's aggregation of amounts based on a number of supporting objects. You can basically roll that up into a summary level and then leverage our declarative tools to perform the corresponding reporting. And then this is all done. How do we actually deliver Batch Apex? Well, we're leveraging our asynchronous framework. And it's the same framework that we've used for Async Apex that's been out for about a year now. And the idea is that we allow you to kick off the process synchronously, but all of the heavy lifting and processing is done on our asynchronous infrastructure. And as we process through this, the way that we manage it is by dividing the scope into logical chunks and then executing those in a serial fashion. And I have a map or a visual of this in the next slide, and I can walk through. One important note is that although Batch allows you to perform these complex long-running operations, we do not bypass the governor limits. And the start, the execute, and the finish all respect these limits. The one place where we allow the flexibility is in the query locator, and it's the query locator that allows you to generate a very large scope and then iterate against that. So how does this all look? Well, if we take a look at the current slide here, let's think about the opportunity or object reassignment. How would we actually build that? Typically, you would have a Visualforce page backed by a controller. On the Visualforce page, you'd have a form that would allow the end user to select the filter for the records that are going to be retrieved, and then specify that owner reassignment. And then on submit, the page would then call the controller, and in the controller, it would take that user feedback and pass that in, construct a class that implements batchable, and then call database.execute batch. And that's all synchronous. And on the execute batch, we pass back an ID to the job, to the overall job. It's the async Apex job ID. And once we've done that as part of that method, we then pass all of this into our asynchronous framework. And so that request is passed to the queued. And then once we have availability, we will invoke start. And the start method returns the query locator. And this is really where we perform the logical separation of creating the scope and then iterating on top of the scope. And as you can see here, start returns the query locator, and then the query locator goes ahead and allows us to call execute, and we take chunks very similar to the API and pass those chunks or context into the executes. And we execute all of those items until we're complete and have finished with the query locator. We then would call the finish method. And it's the finish method, which is really kind of the notification process. So once we've gone through the execution, we've processed through all the records. It's within this method that allows you to perform, whether it's an audit update or an email notification or an update to a summary object. So let's take a look at a simple demo for Batch Apex. The use case is that I want to take, and since I have this set up, we'll just use accounts. I'm going to go ahead and reassign accounts, and I'm going to reassign them. I'm going to change the industry for all the accounts. So let's take a look at the accounts through the reports. You'll see that we have about 40,000 accounts, and they're all tied to one industry. And what I'm going to do is basically leverage Batch Apex to change all of the accounts from baking to another industry, let's say mining. So the way that I'll do that is I can go into Admin Tools, and this Visualforce page just is a entry point for me to look at some of the tools that I've built. And we'll go into Search and Replace. Search and Replace, this is using our Describe API. So this is pulling back the metadata, all of the entities that I've created in this organization. I'm going to select account. I'm going to select industry. And for industry, we're just going to go ahead and change that to mining. When I hit Replace, this is actually going to invoke Batch Apex. And I have another page that is leveraging that async Apex job ID to figure out where the Batch Apex job is from a process standpoint. And as you can see here, it was in the queue. It's now been picked up by our service, and it is starting to process those records. Using the reporting engine, we can quickly go back to see what this actually looks like. And you'll see we've already updated 6,400 records to mining. And if we are to refresh this, we'll see that we're now to 11,000 and so forth. And we can go back to this page and look at the current process itself, viewing the active jobs. And you can see we're 51% of the way through. So how did I do this? Let's go back to, and now I'll actually start at the Search and Replace. So the Search and Replace page, and I'll pull up the Visualforce editor here. See, it's basically one page block section that then renders dynamically a second one, which is based on the describe. So I can select the entity type, and based on the entity type, I go ahead and select the fields. And then I have a command button that calls the action replace. And we'll take a look at the controller to see how this is actually built from an Apex standpoint. So in the controller, we have the get entities that populates this dropdown. That we then have the secondary get fields, which populates the dynamic page block section that's rendered based on the entity that's selected. And then you'll see here on the replace, which is that action, I'm dynamically generating a query. I'm saying select field that was selected from the selected entity. I then will pass in that query into a class search and replace, which I will show you in a second, which implements batch. I pass in the query, I pass in the field, I pass in the value that I'm setting. I then call database.execute batch, and I pass in the instance of that search and replace class. And as you can see here, I also get the ID that's returned. And that's pretty much all we had to do to kick off this batch process to consume the dynamic query. And let's go ahead and take a look at the execution itself. If we go into Apex classes, we can look at the search and replace. And you'll see search and replace, this actually implements database.batchable. And ignoring some of the details here in the finish method, you'll see that this is actually quite lightweight. I have a constructor where I'm passing the values from the form into member variables within this class. I then have the start method, and the start method is going to return that query locator as I illustrated with the earlier diagram. And I'm passing in here the dynamic query. This is going to return the query locator, which is basically a cursor that then we call execute against. And as you can see here at the list or scope, what we're passing in here is a subset of what's returned by that query locator. And by default, it's 200 records. That is configurable, so you can bring that all the way down to 1 record per execute if you needed to. But in general, by default, it's 200 records. And for each of these executes, as you can see, I'm iterating through that scope. I'm leveraging some dynamic Apex here to go ahead and take the field that was selected and set it with the new value that was also selected in the form, and then updating that subset of records. And then this execute will get fired a number of times until we've gone through the entire query locator, and then we call the finish method. Now you'll notice the query here within the finish method. What I'm basically doing is I'm leveraging the database.batchable context, and what that is we inject the ID of the job into the request. And what that allows us to do is pull back all the information for this job, status, number of errors, jobs processed, total job items, and so forth. And then I can use that in my notification. And the notification that I have here is just creating a simple email. And at the end of the process, I go ahead and take all of these items or pieces of information, and I simply generate an email and send it to myself. So if we go back to the reports, we can quickly take a look here to see if this has been completed. And as you'll see, we now have 40,000 records that have been switched from banking to mining. And the nice thing about this is this was all asynchronous, right? So it didn't impact my user session. All of this was being processed within our asynchronous framework, which meant I could have logged out of this application and the process would have continued. It wasn't really based on my session. My session just effectively kicked it off. So that's a relatively straightforward example of Batch Apex. Obviously, a very powerful feature, really just skimming a little bit of detail there, but there's obviously a number of use cases that can be solved now with the introduction of Batch Apex. So on to best practices with Batch Apex. One of the things that we need to be very careful about is the manner in which you invoke Batch Apex. Whether it's through Visualforce web services or email services, you need to make sure that you evaluate the number of batch executions that are already in process or in queued in your organization. There's a limit of up to 5 active batch processes, and active means something that is in queued or in process. Usually it's relatively straightforward to manage that from a Visualforce or web service context, but you need to be very careful from a trigger invocation, because from a trigger invocation, it's very difficult to guarantee that you know when that trigger is going to be invoked, right? A trigger can be kicked off from a UI, from an API request as well, and you can't guarantee the number of records that are passed into that trigger. So ideally, Batch Apex should be invoked from a Visualforce, a web service, or an email service, but if necessary, we do provide the ability to invoke this from the trigger context as well. You just need to pay close attention to the number of executions that are already in flight for that organization. Another item, executes are autonomous requests, and what that means is the batch process itself is logically divided into a number of executes. And if one execute fails, that's not going to impact the overall batch process. That's simply going to fail that specific execution. So it would only roll back that execution, not the entire batch process. And what that means is you need to make sure that you have the right error handling and auditing in place to surface that information once the process is complete. Last but not least, we also introduced a stateful interface, which allows you to aggregate data across executions. And what that means is if I wanted to, let's say, pass some sort of summary level information across all the executes, I can leverage the stateful interface to have a member variable that I can get and set with each of those executes, and then within the finish, take that summary and propagate that to a summary level object or email or whatever it may be. And then last but not least is test, test, test. And getting back into this, I will show you a very simple way of managing and testing batch Apex. So getting back to the example, if we take a look at the batch class, and so here's test blast. Here's my test class that I have. What I've done is I have created a setup operation or setup method that basically creates 200 records with the sample industry 1, and then my batch process is going to change all 200 of those to sample industry 2. And then I'm going to assert that that actually happened within the test context. One item to note, we only allow you to evaluate one execute within a batch process. For obvious reasons, we can't allow customers to test 50 million records, and so the way that we decided to support this is to identify one execute and allow you to assert the behavior of that execute. So in the test itself, I call start test. I then create my instance of search and replace. I then call database.execute batch. And then right after stop test, what this does is this then calls database.execute batch synchronously, very similar to our @future implementation. And what that allows me to do is within the test context, I can actually assert that behavior. So this is kind of a testing hook that we do where we will actually run that batch process and that batch execute all synchronously as part of the test, which then allows you to, after the stop test request, to assert the results of that execution. So if we go ahead and run the test, you'll see that my assert passed, that they were actually set to that second industry. And one item to note, now it does say that I have 100% code coverage, but what that's really saying is that all of the lines of my class were covered. And I know this is a little bit off topic, but one of the things that I typically like to highlight is that when you're looking at testing, never look at just lines covered. What you really want to do is validate and confirm that you've covered all the possible use cases, both positive and negative, that your end users may have with your application. And so this means looking at all the types of permutations that exist when you have a form such as the search and replace, and guaranteeing that that form and all the inputs into that search and replace class have been tested appropriately. And then I think you'll find that the lines of code have been covered a number of times, but what you're really focusing on is making sure that you've covered all the use cases. So getting back to batch Apex, those are kind of some of the best practices. And as I said, test, 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 very important, especially with these very large, long-running processes. So the next thing is custom settings. And custom settings is a very powerful feature that we've been working on for a long time. And the way that I like to describe it is it's really about application metadata. And custom settings allows or provides developers metadata hooks both at the org level and also at a profile and user level. And there's two types of custom settings that we've introduced. The first is the org level list. And at the org level list, you can kind of think of these as metadata or items that you have in your typical executions, whether it's zip codes, postcodes, or some other data set that you typically surface or pull into requests. This is something that we would definitely want you to look at custom settings to manage and maintain. The second is the concept of personalization. And the second custom setting, which is hierarchy, allows you to set values, effectively singletons, at the org, profile, and user level. And what this allows you to do is set values at certain levels in the hierarchy and then override them and leverage our custom settings API to evaluate that at runtime. So why custom settings? Well, number one, custom settings are cached. So what that means is you're not charged for any query, and we have a simplified API that allows you to pull out this information from our cache. So where people have kind of saved metadata for their applications in custom objects, the idea here is that you can now move that information into custom settings, and you no longer have to perform queries to get that. Instead, you can leverage our custom settings API to pull that information into the request. Second, with the API, the list retrieval is pretty straightforward because, again, we're just talking about a list, so we just pull out that collection. The second one, which is that hierarchy that I discussed earlier, the API actually abstracts you from having to look at where the values are being set on the hierarchy. And what I mean by that is I can set values at the org level, the profile level, and the user level. And from a Visualforce context, I can actually perform a call that says, for this running user, get me the custom setting value. And I don't have to look to see if it's been set at the user level. I can simply say, for this user, please get me the custom setting value. And it could have been just set at the org level. It may have been overridden at the profile level, or it was just set at the user level. All of that is pretty much abstracted from that call. You can, of course, explicitly ask for certain areas or certain levels in the hierarchy, but the benefit of the API is it allows you to simply say, for the running user, get me the corresponding custom setting. And last but not least is the obfuscation support. And what that means is a lot of people out there that are building applications, there's been some concern that the metadata that's associated to the application can be modified and changed by the end consumers. And so what we've done is we've provided obfuscation support for managed packages for custom settings. And what that means is you can now create custom settings definitions as well as populate the data into those definitions, and your subscribers are effectively locked out. They don't have access to the entities through the UI. They can't use the API either. And the only way that they have access to it is if you've exposed APIs or web services that provide them access to the data in your managed package. So it's effectively locked out except for code that has the same namespace. So we'll take a look at custom settings. If we go back to the admins tool page that I had for Batch Apex, you'll see here an informational message that highlights the fact that the admin has unrestricted access to this tool set. And if we look at the page, I'm leveraging some simple expressions to determine whether or not certain items are being rendered. And this unrestricted value is being set in the controller. So if we look, the unrestricted value is a Boolean. How do we set it? Well, on the constructor itself, I have a method here, admin_tools.getInstance.unrestricted. And what that is admin tools is a custom setting. I'm using the method getInstance, and once that instance is returned, it then grabs the value for the field unrestricted. And as you'll notice, I'm not asking at the user level, the profile level, or the org level. I'm simply saying, for the running user, get me the unrestricted value for this custom setting. So if we look at how I set this up, we can go into custom settings here, and I'll open up a new tab. We go into custom settings, you'll see my admin tools. It's of type hierarchy. I have one field on it, and custom settings are somewhat similar to custom objects, so you can create a definition that has multiple fields or multiple field types. We can go ahead and manage it. And as you'll see, right now it's set at the org level, and it's set at unrestricted. So behind the scenes, when I made that call, it actually traversed the hierarchy and grabbed the value at the org level. I could, of course, at the profile level, override this. So I can go ahead and say, all right, at the system admin level, I don't want anyone to have access to it. And myself, I'm a system admin. If I go back to this page and refresh it, you'll see that now I have limited access to this page. And I didn't have to change any logic on my page. All I was basically doing is leveraging custom settings. And behind the scenes, it was the custom settings and the override in the hierarchy which changed that behavior. Okay, so that's kind of the high level of custom settings. Again, a very powerful feature for app development, especially if you're looking for personalization for end users. The next thing is the Apex Scheduler. Now, the Apex Scheduler is a pilot feature in winter, and it's something, again, safe harbor here, but it is something that we are looking to GA in the spring release. And what is the scheduler? Again, similar to Batch, I kind of like to describe it as the use cases that we were unable to support previously, which is if you wanted to schedule an Apex process on our platform, there wasn't really any good way to do it. There were some workarounds such as time-based workflow, but in general, the only real way to schedule an Apex execution was leveraging a client-side cron utility. And so what we've done here is we've effectively exposed that on our platform. What that means is you can now schedule Apex execution, whether you can do it through the UI, and we've also exposed an API as well if you're looking to create a very complex schedule. And if you are familiar with cron syntax, then you can actually leverage a cron expression to build a complex schedule on our platform. And as part of the pilot, we're still kind of looking at how many schedules you can have running per organization, but at this point in time, we're looking at supporting up to 10 concurrent Apex schedules. So what this means is you can have 10 schedules running or active per organization. And in the UI, we allow you to schedule once a day, but in the API, we allow you to schedule a process every hour. So let's take a look at how this works. We go back to Apex classes. I have a class called Schedule Me, and you'll see Schedule Me implements schedulable, and all it's really doing is it's just calling that batch process search and replace. And because that was a generic tool, I'm simply going to take this query, select assistant name from contact, and for the assistant name, I'm going to pass in Joe. So this basically means for all contacts, I'm going to change the assistant names to Joe, and I can now schedule this execution by simply placing this inside the schedule interface. We go back to the list of classes. You'll see that there's a new button called Schedule Apex. This allows us to call job name. We'll say UI schedule. Go in here, select the class. It's been filtered to show only those classes that implement that interface. We can set it up monthly or weekly. We'll do weekly, Thursday, Friday. Well, we'll just do every day. And start time, end time for about a month. And we'll kick this off at, let's say, 4 p.m. And if we go into monitoring, we can look at scheduled jobs. You'll see here we now have a scheduled job via the UI. The next scheduled run is on the 10th at 4 p.m. So pretty straightforward way to schedule Apex, but if you wanted a slightly more flexible way of doing this, and if you wanted to build your own scheduling utility, you can leverage Apex and Visualforce. And to highlight this, I'll just use our system log and write some execute anonymous to show you how quickly you can schedule this via Apex. So similar to the batch Apex, this passes back an ID. So ID, cron ID equals system.schedule. We'll pass in the name. Call this Apex schedule. Then the cron expression, which I think is second, minute, hour. We'll do this at 6 o'clock. Every day, every month, day of the week is optional, and we'll just say for 2009. And then we'll create an instance, new, schedule me 2. We'll kick that off, success, take a look at the page. And you'll see my Apex schedule, it's now going to kick off at 6 p.m. today. And it was obviously just submitted via Execute Anonymous via our API. And pretty straightforward in the sense of kicking off and managing schedules. So that's effectively the scheduler as well. Again, pretty straightforward, but a very powerful feature. And we're planning on releasing that in the spring. So some roadmap items. What are some of the things that we're looking to do in the next year? Well, we released quite a few features in the last 2 years, and we're kind of changing focus and really looking at the developer experience on our platform. And what we want to do is provide developers with tools that are going to make them more effective when developing and deploying applications on our service or on our platform. And we feel that the next 2 focus areas for Apex will support this. The first one is the Apex monitoring and debugging framework. And what we're looking to do, we are currently building out a generic event framework that will allow the workflow, Apex, and Visualforce all to leverage a consistent framework for all of the events that are generated within each of those contexts. Once that framework is in place, the next is to look at the system log and really kind of rebuild that to simplify debugging. And the new system log will allow you to filter, and it will also break up each execution, so you can select the execution and see the details of that log rather than having one long-running execution request. The other key element here is that we're also providing filtering for persisting. So for the debug log, you'll now be able to, and again, this is all focusing here for Spring, we're planning to have the ability to allow you to filter out the specific events that you're interested in from a debug perspective, and then all of the logs that are persisted will have that filter in place. Looking past Spring, the next items that we're looking to do is, once we have the complex filtering, the next thing is profiling. So we want to provide profiling tools that allow developers to more effectively identify kind of hotspots within their execution. And once we have the filtering and once we have the profiling in place, the next iteration of the monitoring and debugging framework is the actual Apex debugger. Now, I don't have this as a line item because, again, we're still coming up with the concept, what it's going to look like. But right now, we believe that in the next 18 months or so, we will have a debugging tool that will allow you to replay Apex execution. That is the goal that we have. And so for all of you that have been kind of going through the process and wanting to have that debugger, that is our focus, that we're going to provide you a utility that's going to allow you to step through that Apex execution. And again, very important component here. And we definitely think that the monitoring and the debugging framework is going to make all of our developers more efficient, and it's going to help everyone from a development standpoint, really being able to identify execution as well as profiling on top of that. Second is the enhanced test framework. One of the things that we've seen is a lot of people build tests that are dependent on org data. And what we're looking to do is really silo test execution. And what that allows us to do is guarantee test portability. And if we're going to silo test execution, meaning it no longer has access to application data, we need to provide better setup and tear down utilities. So the second theme here with the enhanced test framework, what we're trying to do is provide very powerful setup utilities that allow you to build up the context that you need to effectively test your application, and do that without having any dependency on application data. And what that means is you'll have much better test portability in the short term and long term. The last vision that we have, or theme, is simplifying the limits. And a lot of you out there have kind of described our limits as an eye chart. And we understand that, yes, there's some pain in those limits, but there's some value as well. And what we're trying to do is figure out how to simplify these limits while still protecting our service. And the idea is to take the limits and really look at what are the resources that we're trying to protect. The resources that we're trying to protect are the CPU, the heap, and the database. And so we want to have 3 buckets that we'll place limits on top of, and hopefully that will give you more flexibility from a standpoint of development. And some of the limits that we had that are somewhat arbitrary, such as the collection limits, those will be going away in the next release. So we're very excited about removing some of these limits, and at the same time, long term, focusing on putting these limits into 3 core buckets, which is the database, the heap, and the CPU. We're going to open it up here and look at some of the questions or top questions that you have, and I'll spend the next 15 minutes or so answering those. How do I participate in the scheduler pilot? Right now, from a development standpoint, that pilot is closed. If you are a current customer and you have not requested the pilot, you can still request it, but we are now limiting it to a select few. We have over 100 people participating in this pilot, and with spring coming around the corner, we need to kind of cut off the pilot at this point. Next question. Are the governor limits different for batch? So as I said in the presentation, batch still respects all the governor limits. They're the same limits as the asynchronous context. So start execute, and finish all respect those limits. The one place in which we do not apply that is in the query locator, but there's really nothing you can do with the query locator. It's just how you generate scope for that execution. Are there any time limits for the execution of each batch or for an entire batch Apex job? It's a great question. Right now, we use the asynchronous framework, and there is no SLA around that. I would expect that the execution of batch Apex is no different than what you see with at future requests. The only difference is with batch Apex, there's going to be a number of executions versus an asynchronous request is typically just one request. Question about PE does not have access to Apex, but an AppExchange package can be flagged to run Apex in a PE org. That is correct. Both batch Apex and scheduler will follow similar to anything else within Apex, meaning a certified managed package that has Apex in it can actually run on a PE org, but a PE org does not have access to author Apex. The next one, which governor limits are applicable in batch Apex? Actually answered that above. That is, it's the WSDL, not the trigger. So WSDL, visual force, and execute anonymous. That's kind of the context in which batch is running. Why are we not implementing the stateful interface in the demo? We weren't implementing the stateful interface because I wasn't using any member variables from an aggregation standpoint. What we were effectively doing is with each execute, I was simply updating that scope. If I was performing some sort of summary or aggregation, I would have definitely used the stateful interface to allow me to take a member variable in that class and get and set that with each of the executes. Does Apex schedule require a user to log in to run? No. It does require a user to set up the schedule, and the schedule execution is then run by the context or by that user, but it does not require a user to have an active session. It's no different than our asynchronous framework in the sense of you kick off the schedule, but then any of the actual schedule events do not require that user to be active. Can you set custom settings using the API? Yes, you can. There is no custom setting API, but custom settings are effectively custom objects. So you would use the same syntax to update and insert a custom setting as you would with a custom object. Do batch processes apply against limits on total number of async requests per day? No, they do not. There is a limit of number of batch items that you can create per day, and I think it's somewhere around 500,000, which is a pretty significant number. But that does not tie into the number of async requests that you have per organization. Can we schedule a job like hourly or based on minutes? You can schedule via the API using a cron expression. You can schedule a job using both minutes and hours, but the frequency minimum or frequency maximum is every hour, meaning you have to specify a minute and you don't have to specify an hour, but you have to specify a minute, which means it could run every hour on a certain minute, but that's the frequency. You can't have it running every minute. Again, you can have up to 10 schedules running. So it is entirely possible to have 10 scheduled jobs being kicked off every hour. Regarding the 10 meg custom settings limit, is that an org limit or a namespace limit? It's actually a namespace limit. So with any AppExchange or managed package, each package will have its own limit. Can scheduled Apex tasks be packaged? The definition of the schedule needs to be created on the subscriber. That is not something that we support just yet, but we are looking at that. What are the governor limits for the schedulers? Well, the schedule request is no different than an asynchronous request, so it's the same limits as async. And then the job itself or the event that's kicked off, that would obviously have its own limits as well. What types of orgs are allowed to have Apex scheduler enabled? Those will be all orgs that have the ability to author Apex. So that is EE, UE, DE orgs, and obviously sandbox orgs as well. The next question, what was the limit that was going away? Again, safe harbor, but in spring we're planning to remove the limit around collection sizes. And so the hope is that collections will no longer be limited to 1,000 items. Instead, it will be simply limited to the available heap. Next question, can you set the schedule to not have an end date? that is possible using cron expression. You can simply use an asterisk for the year, and that will just continue every year. Next question, will we be able to debug inside Eclipse in the next release of the IDE? Not in the upcoming release. This is something that we are evaluating, but right now we're focusing on the improvement of the system log as well as the debug log. During the Salesforce maintenance, will the scheduled jobs run according to the time scheduled? The schedule will try to kick the job off. If for some reason the service is down for maintenance, then the cron will simply kick off that job when it's reactive, meaning if it was scheduled for 1 p.m. and for some reason we went down for maintenance on 12:59 and we came back up at 1:05, the scheduled job would be kicked off at 1:05. Another question, how can I get the demo? That is just a matter of us packaging this up and putting it out there. We haven't done that yet. We're planning to place this on developer.force.com, which is our main entry point for any resources for developers. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to close the session. I want to thank everyone for your time. Again, any questions that you have, please feel free to log those with us or place those on the developer boards. And again, we also have ideas exchange as well if you have any ideas based on the conversation today. And again, thank you.